Okay. Can everyone?
Yeah, we can see.
Okay.
Yeah, we can see your screen. Yeah.
Okay. Thanks, Spencer. So I guess just we're going to start off with a bit of background, and I think everyone kind of intuitively noticed this, but transit and more broadly transportation, it allows us to access different kinds of opportunities and connects us to different sorts of amenities. So the obvious opportunity that we know is jobs, and a lot of research focuses on job accessibility. And there's also a lot of research that focuses on how transit connects us to grocery stores or restaurants or leisure, and maybe more importantly, in the last 2 years, health and essential services. So transit and transportation are very important roles in our day-to-day lives. So when people talk about transit, a lot of times they want to prioritize travel time or the speed of transit or improve the headway and frequency. And sometimes this might not be true for everybody, but reliability and especially disruption kind of falls to the wayside. But reliability and disruption are also equally important considerations. So if a system's unreliable or if there's disruptions happening on a regular basis, that can really create a negative perception among choice riders or riders who choose to use transit when they have other option. And it also causes residents or users to kind of add contingency. They add extra buffer time to their travel time, and they might avoid certain destinations, even though it is reachable within their time budget, just because they kind of fear a delay or disruption happening. So if something's within 45 minutes, maybe they budget an hour or an hour and 15 minutes just in case something happens. We also want to prioritize social equity in our discussion about transit and transportation. So I won't get too much in detail about, I guess, political theory, but like, especially in Canada, there's kind of this goal that we want everybody to have an equal opportunity. So having universal access to certain amenities, being able to reach those jobs at a level playing field. And to do that, we have to recognize that certain groups, they kind of face systemic barriers, and they may need a bit more help in order to reach those opportunities. So when we look at equity-seeking groups, they do not typically have, or a lot of them don't have other modes to kind of switch to. They don't have private autos, or maybe active transportation is just not an option for them. They live in inaccessible areas. So in Toronto, that might be living in Northern Scarborough, which has not very good transit access to the rest of the city. There is kind of increased consequences for being late or missing appointments. So I think a story I recall from January 2020 was when there was that big subway delay. This worker decided he would just call his employer to just quit his job right on the spot, just because if he were to actually show up to work 4 hours late, he would be fired. Whereas more affluent riders, they have the option to just work from home, or if a delay disruption happens, they call it Uber. So they have a lot more flexibility. And a lot of these studies that analyze delays and disruption use what's called graph theory. And it's also just used in many other transit contexts. So things like accessibility studies kind of are built on the foundation graph theory. But what graph theory is, and I'll be talking a lot more about it this presentation, is that it takes, it represents like physical space as a set of nodes and edges. And this comes from the work of Euler in the city of Königsberg back in what is now Russia or Germany. And his challenge was to develop a route that would cross all the, or parade across all the bridges. And so he represented each bridge of the 7 bridges as a edge or a link, and then each of the locations, the North Bank, the island, the South Bank, and the East Bank as a node. And we can see how on the right, this graph, it turns this map into this kind of graph representation. So most subway, if you look at most subway maps, those are also very easy to turn into graphs representations. The stations would be just the nodes, and the subway segments connecting each station would be an edge. So this is a very useful theory that can be applied to transportation context easily. So what I found in past literature around disruption research is that a lot of them are rail transit focused. So they typically focus on just the subway or maybe the train suburban commuter rail network. And that's good, but like in Toronto, we know that 50% of ridership comes from the bus and streetcar network. So those are an equally important mode as well. And many other North American cities, that percentage might be higher. Because they focus mainly on the rail transit network, there's kind of this assumption that headway doesn't matter in their graph representation, and they take steps to simplify or kind of ignore the role of headway. And that's a good assumption if you're focusing on subways, because the train comes very frequently. But if you have bus routes that come every 30 minutes, representing the transfers accurately and taking account the wait time for the next available bus is very important. A lot of disruption studies, they do not really use real-time data and look at real disruptions. So that's something we might look into later in this presentation. And they kind of lack an equity focus. So they develop results for the entire population, but we know that different groups experience the city very differently, and they have different types of exposure or different resiliency to disruption. So they don't really differentiate by different equity-seeking groups. And a lot of studies I've seen, they've used what's called a Lorentz curve and then create a Gini coefficient by using a Lorentz curve. And that doesn't really look at equity, because ultimately it'll be affected by, like, it's really sensitive to changes in the middle, like percentiles, and it kind of implicitly strives for equality, which is good, but we recognize that certain groups may need better transit service than more affluent groups. So with our goals for this project, we were kind of asking a couple questions. So are different population groups more vulnerable to negative transit impacts from transit disruption? Which population groups are more resilient, or they have better redundancy during disruptions? When we look at real disruptions instead of the theoretical scenarios that we come up with, do the results kind of match? And are more accurate graph representations possible with like advances in computing? So in this presentation, we'll answer these top three questions. So first, I'll be looking at what's called network criticality or vulnerability. Then I'll be looking at redundancy, and then we'll look at a case study involving real-time data. So I'll just go over some steps of how we built the graphs and what types of demographic data we use. So the basic route map graph representing stations as nodes and route segments connecting the stations as edges is what I want to focus on first. So general steps were that, like, we made a decision to assign stops to the nearest major or minor intersection or subway station. And then we were going to use those intersections or subway station as our nodes, and the route segments connecting those intersections as our edges. So the result is that not all stops were included in the analysis, especially mid-block stops, but this step reduces the computational burden that we have, and also makes transfers a lot simpler to represent. So we don't need to add like a sidewalk network or a road network on top of our transit network. And then the edge cost, so between two nodes, was just the travel time. So this is a pretty straightforward way to represent the TDC network. And I have on the figure just examples of how we assign stops to the nearest intersection. So we just drew a buffer. The buffer varied in radius depending on the type of intersection, and any stop in that buffer was added to the was assigned to the intersection. In certain cases, for example, the streetcar loop at Victoria Park and Kingston Road, we manually determined that the buffer didn't encompass enough stops, so we just manually modified the buffer. So recently in the transit context, this existed long before it's been used for transit. There's kind of a new type of graph called a time expanded graph. And instead of each node representing an intersection or a stop or station, it represents an intersection or stop or station at a specific point in time. And edges are only drawn if they exist. So this figure below shows how we can turn this regular graph on the left into a time expanded graph. And this really allows us to like model headways and transfers and the transfer time more accurately. So the information, like what time do these hypothetical bus routes depart, it isn't conveyed in a regular graph. And we can even see visually that like the red and yellow lines have a 30-minute headway, the blue lines have a 10-minute headway, and the green lines have a 40-minute headway. So this allows us to deliver more accurate results for our transit network. So as I mentioned, each node represents intersection at a specific minute, and then edges are drawn based off the route arrival times that we find in a transit schedule, and the edges only exist if travel is possible. So if in the schedule we see that on a bus route that it's departs one stop at 6:10 and arrives another stop at 6:12, then we draw an edge for those two particular moments in time. And we don't draw an edge if it's like 6:11 or 6:13. Another thing that makes it different from our route map graph is that we connect zone centroids to our nodes. And then the edge cost connecting zone centroids to our bus stops or intersections is just the walk time. So this just represents the first and last mile solution. So we did a hypothetical exercise. So you don't have to worry about what measure we used in this figure for now, just to see the impact of using the time expanded graph to get our results. And we can see that like the coefficient of variation for these, it really varies. So for subway network, it's really low, but for bus, streetcar, and even the frequent bus network, the variation is really high. So this really shows us that we would get biased results if we used something that doesn't consider headway, and demonstrates the value using time expanded graph to account for routes that have low headway. As we all know, the streetcar and the bus network, they have much lower headway, or much higher headways and lower frequencies than the subway network. This also, this exercise also kind of showed us why the impact of departure time. So we kind of borrowed a practice from accessibility studies where they take results from 6 random departure times in an hour. So for example, 7:02, 7:12, 7:25, 7:37, 7:50, 49, 7:51, and then we average all 6 results together just to make sure we aren't biasing results by the departure time having the bus arriving right at the departure time, or maybe a path involves a long waiting time for the first bus. Because we want to integrate equity, we want to know how different equity groups travel in the city. So with our travel demand survey, or TTS, we can figure out how low income groups or carless households groups travel around in the city, but we don't really have information about the other 4 equity seeking groups that we want to analyze. So they are Black riders, racialized riders, which includes Black riders, recent immigrants, and what we call low English proficiency, or people who are not proficient in English. So what we did is combine census data and the TTS data together on a couple fields. So the 3 fields that they had, or the 2 fields they had in common, was home location and gender. Using the publicly available census data, it kind of limited our ability to match for more accurate demographic results, but it's the best we have right now. The figure on our right shows the travel patterns in the morning rush hour. So red represents more destinations, green represents more origins. And for a lot of groups, there's a large proportion of people going to downtown, but we can also see large people commuting to maybe York University, for example. And different groups are kind of concentrated in different areas. So for the Black population, there's a lot of origins around the Western Road. And for the low English proficiency, for example, we see a lot of origins near Scarborough, Agincourt. So that map is good, but it's also very complex and hard to read. So we kind of simplified it down to this heat map where we just have a 3x3 matrix. So we have the CBD, downtown, the IC, which is inner city, and the suburbs, which represents the Scarborough, Etobicoke, and North York districts. And what we see from this and more disaggregate data is that most equity-seeking groups, with the exception of carless households, they make less trips to the inner city or CBD or the downtown area, and more inter and intra-suburb trips, even in the morning rush hour. So just looking at the AM, I'll try to use my laser pointer, but like we can see for this column that low income, 43% of trips are from a suburb to another suburb, or Black, 37.5% of trips are from suburb to suburb. And then maybe if we want to look at general population, that's down to only 26, and 33% are going from the suburb to downtown. So this kind of shows us how different groups in the city travel. We also, with our trip pattern synthesization, we also kind of found the proportion of travel based off time period. So low income has more trips in the midday and evening periods, and carless households, similar story. With the travel time distribution, we generally found that the average travel time for transit is similar across the board. They might have different shapes to the violin distribution, but the median is generally the same except for carless households. Those trips are noticeably shorter than other groups that we analyzed. And then we can see that like roughly 211,000 trips are made by transit from 7 to 8 a.m. And that racialized transit users make up half of that. And we can basically see that around the majority of the Toronto population belongs into one of our 6 equity-seeking groups that we're analyzing. So now we're going to look into our results. And the first concept I want to talk about is the concept of importance or criticality. So in the disruption research, criticality is just how critical or important individual stations are or route segments are to the performance of the network. So if those stations or route segments are disrupted, how much of an impact does it cause on the entire network in terms of additional travel times or disruption? So we're using a measure called the betweenness centrality. And with all of our but measures, we want to incorporate a population weights because we want to see how the betweenness centrality differs between maybe recent immigrants or low-income users or carless households. So betweenness centrality is a fairly common measure, but we're creating kind of or modifying it so that we incorporate the population weight so we can use it for our equity analysis. So our population weight is just the number of trips from origin destination based off the trip patterns that we kind of found in our previous exercise. And so that's represented. I'm not going to go into the math too much detail, but that's representative for X variable. And betweenness centrality is essentially measuring the ratio of shortest paths that use a station or a route segment. So if it has a high betweenness centrality, much more paths use that station than a station with a low betweenness centrality. So it's sort of analogous to ridership, except it's not quite ridership. So this is our first network measure that we're going to look at. So we looked at entropy of betweenness centrality, of population weighted betweenness centrality. So entropy just measures the disparity. So high entropy means high disorder. And we looked at it for all equity-seeking groups. We also took the top ventile, so anything above the 95th percentile, our results, and looked at the average for that. So our intention with this is to look at the busiest stations or the busiest nodes and see how busy are they, how critical are they, how important are they to different users. And together we can kind of conclude that most equity-seeking groups, they have a higher entropy. That means they have more differences between the highest PWBC and the lowest PWBC. And among the highest PWBC, we can see that it's somewhat similar or slightly higher than the general population represented in blue. So we can kind of conclude that for most equity-seeking groups, except carless households, they're more concentrated onto the busiest route segments or stations, but only slightly. So if those busiest route segments or stations are disrupted, then we'll see a much higher impact because they're not as distributed across the network. We also looked at it by mode, and so we divided into 5 modes: outer subway station, inner subway stations, streetcar routes, and then the 10-minute network on the TDC, as represented by frequent bus routes and regular bus routes. So inner subway stations, they're just any subway station located inside the former municipality of Old Toronto. And for the subway network, it's pretty much even across the board. There might be some small differences, but we can really notice among streetcar and bus routes. And this really confirms kind of prior literature that the equity-seeking users, with the exception of 3 groups, they have a higher criticality of the bus network. If the bus network is disrupted, then those equity-seeking groups are going to have more negative impacts. Whereas if you have a disruption on the streetcar networks, it's mostly going to affect carless households and more affluent riders. And that makes sense when you look at the context of how Toronto's built. So the streetcar network serves mostly the inner city and downtown, and generally more affluent people have accessibility to the streetcar network. Our next measure is called global efficiency, and this is just the summation of the inverse summation of travel time. So it measures how easily can riders access their destination. And as with the betweenness centrality, we also add in population weight, and we're making in the implementation we have done, we're comparing the global efficiency to the baseline. And after each iteration, we remove a set of stations or route segments from the network, and then recalculate global efficiency and see how much the performance declines as we remove more nodes or edges, which represents how the network gets more disrupted as we remove more nodes or edges. So if we remove like an edge or station that has a high global efficiency, population weighted global efficiency, then we can see that the travel time or the excess or delay will increase among the total travel time. So on this graph, this is just showing percentages. So as we remove 1,000 nodes, I think roughly the network has around 9,000 nodes or intersections. It's already at 95% the efficiency of the baseline network. And then as we move down to maybe removing 4,000 nodes, so roughly half the intersections, the network performs around 60%. But this really differs among different population groups. So we have this graph, but we can also just do the ratios, and we calculate the ratios compared to the general population. So for Black low English proficiency riders and recent immigrants, the ratios get lower and lower compared to general population as the network becomes more disrupted. So this is telling us that they have a higher negative impact than the general population. Whereas for carless households and low income groups in the peak periods, they're kind of having a less impact than the general, as the network gets more disrupted than the general population, because we can see their ratios starting to increase. So, and this is very true for carless households. Like they are much more resilient and are much less critical nodes than the general population. And we did the same thing with this graph measure by looking at it by mode. So we're seeing much higher drop-offs for the PWRGE. So for the Black and low income groups. So this is indicating that they place higher criticality on the bus routes compared to other equity seeking groups. And carless households, general population, and low English proficiency have a higher criticality for the streetcar network. So for the subway, it's kind of a small difference, but we do see that there are some differences. So recent immigrants place more importance or criticality on the subway networks, and we can kind of conclude from our trip patterns that, like, compared to other equity seeking groups, there's a high proportion of recent immigrants that commute from suburb to downtown, whereas Black and low income, there's more suburban travel, so they're less kind of affected by subway disruptions, but more so by bus network disruptions. A lot of previous research kind of shows that, like, the bus is really important to equity seeking groups. Very famous case study in Los Angeles for the bus network versus the LRT network there. And this is more or less confirming that kind of thread. So next, we want to look at redundancy. And this is kind of just excess capacity in the network or a number of alternative options available. And if there's a disruption, then greater redundancy means riders are still able to reach their destinations and they're more resilient. So two measures called connectivity and average neighboring node degree are used for the first part, and they just rely on the regular non-time expanded graph. So again, not going to get too much into the math, but connectivity measures the frequency and the quality of transfers and how easily people can move around the network. Average neighboring node degree measures the frequency of service at adjacent stops. So if your stop is disrupted, can you go to a nearby stop and still have quality service? And these two measures kind of confirms results. So in the early morning, so 4 a.m. departures, we see that Black riders have lower results than other groups. These two heat maps are just showing ratios compared to the highest performing groups. In these cases, it'll be recent immigrants across households. And in other periods, they have a slightly lower connectivity and average neighboring node degree for Black and low income and low English proficiency riders compared to other groups such as the general population or across households or recent immigrants. We also plotted it by ward. So for average neighboring node degree, we can kind of see much better results in downtown wards such as Toronto Centre, Spadina, Fort York. And then for connectivity, we see much better results in maybe, I think that is St. Paul's, I can't remember, and Don Valley West. But for both maps, they kind of show that better results are in better transit accessible areas. And those transit accessible areas are also generally more affluent parts of Toronto. For example, Northern Etobicoke, Etobicoke North has very low results for both these measures. And it also has a higher proportion of equity-seeking groups and more neighborhood improvement areas. Another measure, so this was just recently created in 2020, and we kind of adapted it for our purposes, is the additional path measure factor. So if you're at the shortest path, which is usually the primary path or option that you take for commuting, if that path is unavailable, are there still other viable paths that can get you to your destination with a small delay? So the small delay varies. So for the 30-minute trip, we define a small delay as like a 5 minutes. For a 2-hour trip, we defined it as maybe 10 minutes. So can you still get to your destination in under 30 minutes? We were very limited by the computational power. So that's why we kind of choose these ranges. If we had better computation, maybe we would have increased the buffers or delays. And this measure accounts for path overlapping. So if you have two options, but for a significant part of your trip, you use the same subway line, they aren't really distinct paths. They're kind of like maybe have 1.5 paths. So this measure kind of accounts for path overlapping and many paths using the same segment. So it's a very complex kind of measure to compute. So first we have to get the overlapping factor, and that's defined by this equation, and it just takes into account how much of the travel time is shared with other paths. Then we get the effective number of paths. So using that overlapping factors, how many paths do we actually have? The third is just a simple cases of how much delay do we add to the shortest path travel time. So as I said before, if it's 120 minutes, then we add 10 more minutes. And then the additional path factor weighted by population is just comparing, I think this, let's see, this fraction might be slightly wrong, but it's just the number of viable paths over the shortest paths. So for our additional path factors, we've been dealt by shortest path travel time because longer paths have more alternative options compared to more shorter paths. And we see that for shorter, like under 60 minutes, where the majority of transit trips are, most equity seeking groups are similar or slightly less than the general population for how much alternative options they have. Whereas for longer paths, which are kind of a minority of total transit trips, they have more options than the general population or cross households. And again, this is kind of attributing to more inter and intra-suburb trips. So shorter paths, those equity-seeking groups are concentrated in the suburbs, or there's a higher proportion of suburbs, and which has lower transit service than the core Toronto area. And for trips under 60 minutes, that means they wouldn't have much alternative options. So our kind of last chapter or phase of the study is, okay, we know all this theoretical results, and if a hypothetical disruption occurs randomly on this node, maybe the equity-seeking groups have much more negative impacts. But what happens when we look at real results? So we have real-time data for around December of 2019. And we want to do global efficiency analysis on the real-time results. And we're comparing the global efficiency to we're using the GTFS schedule as our baseline. So just like how way back here, we used a non-disrupted node or edge removed network as our baseline. In this real-time data analysis, we're using the GTFS network as our baseline, and then using the real-time results for to compare against the baseline. So we have data from two sources. So there's the next train arrival API, the times that you see on the subway screen. That's how we can find the subway arrivals and departures. And then next bus API, so the real-time bus arrival data that you have on your phone, such as Transit app or using Nextbus, that gives us data for the bus and streetcar network. We did have a bit of an issue with the Scarborough RT. There's no data from either of these data sets for the Scarborough RT, and we have we actually use limited Wi-Fi data. So the Wi-Fi data can track your arrivals and departure in the station to provide information for the Scarborough RT. But it was only available at 2 stations on the RT. So we only use the Wi-Fi data to remove trips from the GTFS. We don't really have true real-time results for line 3, but what we did was a good approximation of what actually occurred. So we didn't really talk about this, but when we look at the baseline GTFS network, just how well can people travel and the travel times without any disruptions, without any removals? How did they compare among different groups? So this kind of matches our intuitive sense that in a perfect scenario with no delays, disruption, cars households have lower travel times than the general population, and Black and low English proficiency has maybe higher travel times and lower global efficiency than the general population. But these differences are they aren't huge, but they're still pretty noticeable. Like a 5% drop is pretty noticeable. So we computed travel times for all 23 dates and 5 periods. So in total, it was 115 graphs that we computed results for. And what this plot is showing is excess travel times compared to the baseline. So pretty much like I think everybody intuitively knows that like the arrival and departures from the schedule never really match what's actually happens in real life. And this graph shows that like for the 4 daytime periods, the morning peak, midday, afternoon peak, and evening, every day has kind of excess travel times. So there's some sort of routine delays, whether it's like a bus being broken down or bunching occurring or a subway alarm being pulled. What's interesting is though, for the early morning, we're seeing kind of consistently faster travel times for most days than this baseline schedule. But we all can also identify disruptions. So days or periods where there's much higher excess travel times. So these 5 periods, those are major disruptions. And when we looked at the TDC service alerts Twitter account, we can see that it was weather that caused those disruptions. So those days have snow and ice storms. And then the Twitter account just posted a tweet that says, expect delays on all routes and all travels and or all modes. Whereas for maybe recurring delays or routine delays that happens on these days, they post alerts for specific routes. And this graph kind of intuitively makes sense based when we look at the Twitter data. So when we look at our results, I just want to go over how to interpret the results. So we drew an identity line, and we're plotting on the y-axis the equity-seeking group global efficiency, and the x-axis the general population global efficiency. So if we have plots here in the green region, that means equity-seek groups have higher travel times than general population during disruptions or delays, and a lower global efficiency. Maybe in the blue region, they have lower travel times, lower increase in travel times, and a higher global efficiency than general population. And then anything in this quadrant, that means below 100% efficiency, that means compared to the baseline network, they're having an excess travel time or increase in travel time compared to baseline. So for most plots, most of the points are below the 100%, except for the blue points. Those represent the early mornings. And as we kind of gone over here, the early mornings have consistently faster travel times. But it's interesting to see how the results look for different groups. So like Black and low income in particular, it's true for the other equity-seeking groups, but we noticed that they have much better, or they have much higher global efficiency than the general population. And that's telling us that it has a lower increase in travel time during delays and disruption than the general population. So when we look at recent immigrants, they're kind of more along the identity line and maybe even slightly below the identity line, which tells us that they have a slightly higher or equal travel time during delays and disruption than the general population. You can also identify disruptions, just these points that are way off near the 80% mark. So those represent our kind of disruptions that we observe, whereas most points are concentrated in the 90% mark. So we think this is because just the distribution of trips, there's more suburb trips, and buses are less likely to have catastrophic impacts compared to a subway disruption or a streetcar disruption. So I think prior research shows that an average bus or streetcar disruption causes around 90 minutes of delay. And for groups that don't use bus or streetcar networks or the subway or streetcar networks because their trips start or end well away from the bus or streetcar or the subway and streetcar networks, they're less likely to experience those catastrophic delays. We also have an alternative violin plot. So the red line represents the baseline results that we see here. So when we have actual data, do the ratios of the global efficiency, do they change? And the answer is they do change. So for most equity seeking groups, they're actually higher or even above 1. So they have better global efficiency than the general population, and they're definitely above the baseline results, showing that they are more redundant and face less disruptions and are more or less vulnerable. And it's more pronounced in the AM rush hour and the afternoon rush hour. We can also see that for recent immigrants, their results are kind of similar or maybe slightly below in the peak periods compared to the general population. And for this map, the white dot represents the median of the 23 dates. So with our analysis, we can make a couple conclusions that when we look at our theoretical results, we might see that equity seeking groups are more vulnerable and maybe less resilient, but our real-time results showed that it wasn't the case. And with our theoretical results, we're kind of having an implicit assumption that all edges and nodes fail at the same probability. But we know that buses don't really have the same, if there's a breakdown of buses, they can easily divert. And that's not really possible with streetcar or subways disruptions. What we're seeing is the differences are small, or they might be even slightly more beneficial to equity seeking groups, but we aren't really seeing vertical equity. Equality is not equity. And that small difference, the small benefit, is not enough to overcome the systemic barriers they have in terms of lack of alternative modes or just living in going to transit inaccessible areas. So there's still more to be done in terms of achieving equity. So some novel practices that we introduced is that for our time expanded graph, we kind of simplify the transfer process and have transfers without needing the sidewalk or the road layer. We added population weights to all of our graph measures to consider the equity impacts, and also some measures such as between centrality, they weren't possible on the time expanded graph without modification. I won't get too much detail, but it's because each node represents a node at a particular intersection, particular state of time. So we had to modify that to kind of consider that. And then we also use real-time data on global efficiency to see how disruptions, what the impacts of real disruptions have on the network. We have a long list of limitations. So the TTS data doesn't really have as much demographic information as we want. And combining the census and TTS data, it works for our study, but it could be more accurate. So it would be nice if there'd be better fusion of the two data sets. And I think another student that I know has worked on it. But it'd be even better to have the questions of demographic questions in the TTS itself. We don't really have intersectionality with our studies. So we don't know, for example, how results differ for Black and low income versus just Black alone or low income alone, or recent immigrants and low English proficiency. So, adding on to that, we don't really have a group for affluent users. We compare everything to the general population, but we know that more than half of our transit riders are belonging to one of our 6 equity seeking groups. And the limitations in the data and our synthesization process kind of prevents us from having a dedicated group for defining who affluent users are. We can also make improvements to our graphs. So we don't have capacity constraint. So it might route paths to certain routes over the capacity. In real life, if that happens, a person might be forced to wait 10, 15 minutes for 5 or 6 buses to pass. but this behavior isn't really modeled in our time expanded graph. We could add back mid block stops in the future if computation is less of an issue. And we can also get more accurate real-time data. So I mentioned the problems we had with the Scarborough RT, but the real-time data that we have don't have what's called run as directed buses. So these buses act as subway replacement shuttles, but they also are used in regular service when there's no subway disruptions. And those are not modeled on the NextBus API. So those are some of the limitations that we have and future things that other projects can improve on this work. So that just brings up to this end of the presentation, and I can answer any questions in the chat.
Thank you so much, Rick. Amazing work. So we have a short time for a couple of quick questions. If there are any questions to Rick. Any questions? We have a few minutes. We have maybe for one or two questions. So Rick, yeah, I have one question. So how do you, like, I know you've also been exposed to the research on accessibility analysis for analyze equity. So how do you compare your results to the general results, accessibility results, especially like in the context of Toronto? So,
yeah, so there's been I think a couple authors that have done like accessibility research. I think Ahmed El-Ghanadi and was one, and they kind of shown that like I think Jeff Allen and Steve Farber were another. They kind of show that like it is horizontally equitable for accessibility among travelers in Toronto, and Toronto doesn't have the same history with like discrimination that you see or segregation that you see in American cities, where there's much different results for low-income users in the inner city versus suburban users who use commuter rail. So this kind of shows that like it is similar, because we're seeing that it's either equal or slightly better with our real-time results. And then for our theoretical results is slightly to maybe more disruptive, but it isn't showing like it isn't outright refuting the past accessibility research.
Perfect. Yeah, very interesting. Okay, so if there are no further questions, again, maybe everyone can join me in thanking Rick for his amazing work and congratulating him for finishing this impressive piece of work. Well, thank you so much, Rick, and all the best in your next stage in your career. Thank you so much. And thank you everyone for joining us. Okay, bye now.